Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to be discussing African Americans after 1970. So in our last lectures we discussed the Carter administration and the Reagan administrations, the two presidencies directly following the Watergate scandal. Gerald Ford, of course, succeeded Dick Nixon in 1974. And he lost his reelection bid in 1976 to Jimmy Carter. Carter, of course, as we discussed in our last lecture, was a very unlikely candidate. He did not really seem like the type of person who would have become president before the counterculture revolution. Didn't really have any federal experience. His most highest office had been the serving as the governor of Georgia. But Carter won the election. He was a very skilled politician in his own right and a diplomat of some repute. His presidency was maligned by by a series of very unfortunate circumstances, from stagflation, that is a stagnant economy that also bore witness to a great rise in inflation, as well as foreign disasters such as the Iran hostage crisis and the bumbling of efforts to rescue those hostages. But its administration was noted for making human rights a prime advocacy area, as well as striking the Camp David Accords. And of course, Ronald Reagan defeated Jimmy Carter in the election of 1980, and he subsequently won re-election handily over Walter Mondale in 1984. Reagan's administration was noted for heralding this new coalition in the Republican Party. The party had been rebuilt largely in 1968 by Dick Nixon, who brought in what he called the silent majority. That is, conservative-minded individuals who wanted to undo everything of the counterculture revolution. Now, Nixon did not during his administration, and he really didn't seek to, once he gained office, to sort of undo a lot of the counterculture revolution. There were certainly some things that he neglected to enforce, certain things of civil rights that we'll get to in these lectures. But Nixon didn't go out of his way to greatly undo everything. He certainly didn't make any moves to undo. Did not go out of his way to undo the program instituted by Franklin Roosevelt during the 1930s. And he did not go out of his way, he did not really even attempt to try to undo the legislative bulwark of the Johnson administration, the Great Society legislation. And of course, Reagan didn't do that either. Reagan, as we discussed in our last lecture, his administration were plagued by a series of scandals, scandals involving members of his cabinet and lower-ranking executive officials. Reagan himself was able to escape these scandals relatively unscathed. He emerged from the fire unburnt, so to speak. Though there certainly remains a lot of controversy surrounding his awareness and his direction of these illegal activities. Now, Reagan's administration was also noted for seeing witnessing or seeing the joining of several key demographics to conservative politics. For one, he kept his hold on the conservatives brought in by Dick Nixon, but he also added to that the curious mix of evangelical Christians and conservative libertarians. That created a sort of noxious brew, as those groups often had divergent interests. And one of the things that sort of bore out during the course of Reagan's two administrations were that the evangelical community sort of got the idea of became hip to the fact that even though they supported Reagan and that they looked to Reagan to be their sort of knight in shining armor, his policies really didn't align with theirs. He wasn't so interested in turning back the clock and not allowing and sort of disavowing everything that the counterculture had brought into the national consciousness. For example, he was not really willing to sort of go back to the traditional gender roles. It was under his presidency that the first ever female associate justice to the Supreme Court was nominated and confirmed. It was under his watch that prayer in school remained very much keeping prayer out of school, I should say, remained very much a law. He did not reintroduce or seek to reintroduce public prayer in school. He also didn't attempt to undo any of the social welfare legislation. He didn't attempt to roll the clock back and sort of outlaw civil rights protections. Although he didn't do a lot to enforce it, and he did do some to strip them away, he didn't do anything to sort of roll the clock back to 1963. He also didn't try to roll the clock back to 1930 or 1928 as far as Social Security and welfare are concerned. And with that being said, I'd like to dive right into our lecture topic for today, and that explanation sort of took up a lot of our time. But getting into our lecture today, I'd like to begin by saying that history does not repeat itself, but there are established patterns that do occur, and that human behavior is often repetitive. The history of race relations in the Republic in the latter halves of the 19th and the 20th century really bear witness to that phenomenon. They were, on the one hand, marked by ethnic confrontations, violence, and of course massive social upheaval. In the 19th century, this was due to the outbreak of the United States Civil War, reconstruction of the former rebel or slave states, and of course the redemption of the slave states by those who very knowingly, very consciously attempted to roll back all the gains made by the African American community during Reconstruction and of course the United States Civil War. Now in the 20th century, it was in the 20th century, this sort of similarity bears out in the methods used to support Jim Crow segregation, which rose as a result of the redemption of the former slave states. And it also sort of bears out in the mid-20s, well, not really sort of, it does bear out, de facto and de jure, it bears out in the mid-20th century civil rights movement. Both periods saw the federal government step in and enact a series of pro-civil rights legislation designed to bridge the racial divide and to create a more egalitarian and just society in the Republic. And most importantly, they sort of bear out the collapse of the old black codes that were used to sort of outline and define slave behavior in the Republic, and of course the collapse and the disintegration of the legalized Jim Crow barriers that affected both voter rights, and of course the behavior of African Americans in the Republic. Now the high water mark of these periods were followed immediately by a pattern of retrenchment. Redemption was followed by Jim Crow segregation and the Plessy decision, and the end of the nonviolent phase of the mid-20th century civil rights movement was followed by the demand for black power and of course rioting, both of which had a pronounced effect on the support for future civil rights efforts. Now both eras bore witness to the loss of allies and such as the radical Republicans in the 1860s and 1870s, and of course the loss of allies such as European American liberals in the 1960s. And both groups either lost interest or became disillusioned and hostile, had to demand for greater equality and justice rose from the African American community. Now, this fallout was accompanied by judicial retreat. The courts whittled away at pro-civil rights legislation in the courts of the mid 20th century, and this was also marked by in the 20th century. This was marked by the invalidation of affirmative action laws that were designed to assure minorities equal representation in many of the nation's institutions. Now, there are some differences between the reactions in these two periods. For one, the attitude in the late 20th century remained far less virulent than the attitudes that many Americans had in the 19th century. The backlash against civil rights was mainly confined to the former slave states in the 19th century, but in the 20th century, due to the great migrations of African Americans out of the Republic, and of course the settling of the American West, the backlash was expanded to include the entire Republic, the entire nation. Now, in 1968, 1968 was a very crucial year for the United States, for the Republic. It was, on the one hand, a presidential election year in which the incumbent would not be running. Civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in April of 1968, and Senator Robert Kennedy, who was looked upon as the most liberal candidate, the most appealing and the most liberal candidate in the election, was assassinated 2 months after Martin Luther King had been assassinated, as he sought the Democratic Party's nomination. Outspoken segregationists like George Wallace reappeared, and Wallace himself launched a presidential campaign centered on restoring quote-unquote law and order, which was interpreted by many as a thinly guised appeal to restore segregation by appealing to voters who were angered by the riots of the late 60s, and of course all of the countercultural protests and all of the countercultural revolutions. The eventual winner of the election of 1968 was Richard Nixon. And he took a page out of Wallace's book by making restoring law and order a central theme in his campaign for his presidential candidacy, to appeal to a group that he labeled the silent majority. And the silent majority that he was referring to were suburban voters who were frustrated by the countercultural revolution, the advent of the hippie movement, anti-war protesters, black radical activists, and the perceived breakdown in the social order. Now, Nixon, upon assuming office, he had no inclination to support civil rights legislation or programs. In fact, Nixon's approach to the African American community was internally described as benign neglect, a sort of throwback to the policy that the British Parliament used for governing the American colonies, their colonies around the world, with the exception, of course, of the very profitable Caribbean colonies, in which they very actively oversaw and protected and defended. Now, the Nixon administration was also noted for retrenching on the Great Society programs. Now, Nixon did not abandon them, but he certainly did oversee the cutting of the federal budgets that was allocated to those federal programs. And these programs was largely designed to combat poverty and other social ills. Policies and programs that Lyndon Johnson held very close to his heart and that he wanted to see enacted to make the Republic better. Nixon also sought to refigure the composition of the federal judiciary by placing notably socially conservative judges on the bench. Noted segregationists such as Harold Carswell, who had previously attempted to prevent the integration of a local golf course in Florida, was one of Nixon's first picks to receive a seat on the Supreme Court. That nominee didn't work out, but Nixon's second choice worked out particularly well for his cause. He selected has an associate justice, William Rehnquist, who would later go on to serve as the chief justice of the Supreme Court. And Rehnquist was extremely hostile to civil rights. He was extremely hostile and confrontational when it came to protections to civil rights. Now, this policy of rolling back civil rights through court rulings will continue through the Reagan and Bush administrations of the 1980s and the early 1990s. Nixon's strategy was to frustrate liberal pro-civil rights groups by placing by placing conservative judges on the bench. But he also had to contend with the liberal pro-civil rights judges that were still on the federal bench, who forced the issue of school desegregation in 1971 when one of those federal judges ordered the Charlotte Mecklenburg School District in North Carolina to desegregate by busing children, by sending children of different ethnicities into different locations to ensure that everyone got access to the same, everyone received access to the same type of quality education. The student busing plan involved sending students from predominantly or all African American schools out of their neighborhoods into predominantly or all European American schools in other parts of the district. A contemporary alternative to busing, however, was to simply merge the local school districts into one unit. Now, this was a thought that was brought in to unite the predominantly, at this point, African American inner city school districts with the predominantly European American outer city school districts or suburban school districts. Now, the merger plan was rejected by the courts. The courts favored the busing plan to integrate schools, and that sort of alternative plan reared its head multiple times throughout the latter half of the 20th century. Now, in a very sad and ironic twist, the most radical and ardent opposition to the busing scheme came from the bastion of 19th century pro-civil rights sentiments, Boston. Boston had been the undisputed capital of anti-slavery abolitionist sentiments before the Civil War. Moreover, Boston remained a liberal city through the 19th century and early 20th century. The 1960s bore witness to the radical overtures by the Massachusetts state legislature. For example, the Racial Imbalance Act that was passed by the state legislature saw an effort to integrate school systems throughout the state, notably the school system in Boston. Now, then in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the forces of integration within the city, within Massachusetts and other locations, they develop a plan for what they call magnet schools. And these schools will be schools that received extra funding, and they will be endowed with extra services that were designed to draw students from across municipalities, from across cities. There was even talk of merging the school districts in Massachusetts and in Boston into simply one unit, but these plans were met with stiff resistance from Irish Catholic residents from South Boston. And in an effort to sidestep the opposition, one judge, Judge Arthur Garrity, ordered the busing of students from predominantly African American areas. Most notably, he ordered the busing of students from the Roxbury neighborhood to South Boston High School. Now, the previous decision, this one was bitterly resented by the residents of South Boston, and in scenes that harkened back to those disheartening images of the attempt to, in the 1950s, of the attempt to integrate Little Rock's Central High School. African American students who arrived at South Boston High School in the fall of 1974 were met by local inhabitants shouting racial epithets, throwing missiles, and oftentimes spitting in the direction of these students. Only the presence of hundreds of anti-riot police prevented the situation from exploding into chaos and mob violence. Had the students would head towards buses, or had the students would depart or disembark from the buses. Now in Michigan, the locals' resistance to busing actually torched the locals who in an effort to resist these busing schemes, they actually torched the buses. They actually burnt down the school buses to prevent the students from being sent to other to other schools to enact integration. As integration efforts intensified, tensions remained high for many years, for quite some years afterwards, with de facto segregation sort of settling in amongst the students in classrooms and cafeterias and also in recreation areas. There are a number of accounts of students of adults now, middle-aged to elderly adults now, who went through this sort of desegregation, and they all attest to the fact that when it came to sitting in classrooms, they would sort of group up, bunch up along ethnic lines. That in cafeterias they would sort of sit at tables along ethnic lines. And on playgrounds and in schoolyard recreational areas, they would sort of group up in recreational arcs, ethnic groups. They would sort of just, if one group was on the soccer field, another group would be on the basketball court. If one group was by the volleyball area, the other group would be by bleachers and so forth. They would just sort of allow this sort of de facto segregation to creep back in. Now, busing represented the fundamental flaw of integration. While it was possible to overcome with great difficulty the legal apparatuses of segregation, the overt racist legislation used to support Jim Crow, it was an easy fix to simply say, well, that's wrong. This is a bad law. We're going to put in this new law. This new law is better. The unwritten codes that kept the ethnicities apart in schools and in neighborhoods, where settlement patterns had been established by the generations who had lived under Jim Crow and by the generations who had lived under slavery and emancipation. Those patterns were much more difficult. Those obstacles were much more difficult to overcome. Redressing these historically racist patterns of such as the patterns in employment and housing and college enrollment and in business employment and business opportunities, that was an almost monumental sort of megalithic type of effort. The people of this generation, while they meant well, they really weren't that far-sighted. They really didn't have that great of a grasp to actually take those fateful steps to enact policies that could accomplish that type of goal. In the end, desegregation of public schools solved very little of the ills. It did not build a really unified society, as many parents pulled their children out of public schools and simply enrolled them in private schools, which only served to sort of reinforce, not sort of, but it did serve to reinforce de facto segregation. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, federal courts began to abandon busing as a means of integration. And by this time, the 70s and 80s, you have the Nixon picks and you have the Reagan picks for the federal judiciary stepping into play, moving away from integration, moving away from those liberal policies of the Johnson administration. The busing controversy gave way to another controversy, and this one involved affirmative action. Now, affirmative action was the legal mechanism used and employed by the government, by the federal government, to undo the ingrained social patterns of the Republic, those ingrained racial patterns or racial discriminatory patterns that were established in the Republic throughout the history from 1619 up until their time, up until the mid-1970s. Affirmative action was the policy used to sort of redress those issues. Now, while affirmative action was not as violently opposed as, let's say, busing and desegregation of schools, it was still widely resented. And in our next lecture, we'll turn to addressing affirmative action, and seeing how that the early stages of it unfolded across the Republic. Now, as always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you thought about this lecture. And I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.